authority by which President Obama's health care law was enacted. Does anybody know what the constitutional basis of that law is? The answer is the Commerce Clause. That's a somewhat obscure provision in the United States Constitution that's used to enact a lot of different federal laws. Now, words are powerful things, especially in the legal realm. The words of our U.S. Constitution are binding, create a binding relationship between the people and our government, our federal government. So our Constitution prescribes enumerated powers, and enumerated powers are those that, what that means is that the federal government can't do anything that the Constitution doesn't prescribe. So in order for any law to be enacted by Congress, it has to be stated or prescribed in the Constitution. It has to be prescribed in the text, the actual text of the Constitution. So one enumerated power that's relevant today is of course, the Commerce Clause. And I put the text of the Commerce Clause on your handout there, because it's important to read the actual language and text. So the Commerce Clause is contained in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution, and it reads as follows. Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So over the years, the courts have created a series of tests in order to kind of define what that language means. And I kind of summarize the case law or that was produced from all these series of hundreds of cases over the years. So that's the current, what's below the text there, those three tests are how the courts currently interpret that constitutional language. So test number one, so the Commerce Clause empowers the Congress to regulate the following. So Congress can regulate these things under these descriptive tests. Number one are channels of interstate commerce. So those are things like highways, waterways, railroads, and air traffic. So if you look at it like you have two states and it's something that connects the two states, so like, rivers and highways. So it's something where commerce is passed between the two states, and that allows that to happen. So Congress can regulate those activities. Secondly, are instrumentalities of interstate commerce. That's of course cars, trucks, ships, airplanes, and so those are things that carry goods or commerce and carry it across state lines. So federal government can regulate cars, for example. Now the third one is the tricky one, and that's known as the affectation doctrine. And it's activities that substantially affect interstate commerce. And there are two caveats to it, that A and B, but basically it can be summarized as that the courts draw a distinction between economic and non-economic activity and local and national activity. So the bottom line is that if something is non-economic and local, then it violates the Commerce Clause. So it has to be, so if it's something intrastate, it has to be an economic activity for the affectation doctrine, for the law to pass the affectation doctrine and be valid. All right, so now we have to apply this to the healthcare law that was passed just about a year and a half ago. And this is currently going through the courts, and the courts are divided on it right now. So it's going to be decided by the Supreme Court eventually. So Congress used the Commerce Clause as their enumerated power to enact the healthcare law. The specific issue, the most important issue, is something called the individual mandate in the healthcare law. And basically, it's whether the individual mandate violates the Commerce Clause. And the individual mandate in the healthcare law simply says that every citizen in the United States has to purchase federally approved health care. and if you don't, you suffer a monetary penalty. So clearly, clearly the individual mandate is not a channel or instrumentality, so it would fail the first two tests. So the real question is whether it passes that third test, the affectation doctrine. And this is a novel issue. It's never come up before in the courts, because really the issue is whether the non-purchase of health care is an economic activity. Is economic inactivity, is that an activity somehow? So if a lot of people don't do something, does that reverberate and create an economic activity, if that makes any sense? So critics argue that if this law stands, there is no limit to the reach of the Commerce Clause, and therefore national power becomes limitless. Now, supporters argue that if the courts overturn this law, it would be thwarting the will of the people and blocking the full exercise of Congress's authority. So the words of our Constitution are extremely important. The fate of this healthcare law depends on how the Supreme Court interprets these words. Words are powerful, they govern our lives and protect our freedom. So in order to live in a civilized society governed by laws, we have to be able to understand language and interpret that language in good faith.